Welcome to the WANA Webinar Series. As you will notice, all participants have been muted. If you have a question to ask, please send your question into the Q&A panel located on the bottom right-hand side of your screen, or by pressing the three-dot option along the bottom and selecting the Q&A panel. Your questions will be answered after the presentation. If you need any technical assistance, please send a private chat to the host, the directions of which you can find in the chat window. Thank you for joining, and please welcome Alex from Fountain House.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Alex Baldassare, and welcome to today's webinar. Over the next hour, you will hear lots of information about the current mental health crisis response in America and the specific campaign we are responding with to address this crisis. However, we hope you take away something more than that. Today, we hope to show you how these issues, or issues like it, may arise in your communities, and how the Clubhouse can feel empowered by taking on their own advocacy, creating vital awareness to everyone's benefit. From Fountain House today, we are joined by Mary Crowley, Senior Vice President and Chief External Affairs Officer, and Christina Sparrick, Member Advocate Extraordinaire. Then we will also be joined by Bill Wasserman, Partner and President of M&R. And rounding things out, we will be hearing from our friends from San Antonio Clubhouse, Executive Director Eric Estrada, and Staff Generalist Tahlar Rowe. Without further ado, I'll throw it to Mary, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Alex. It's great to be here with all of you. I think this webinar series is just wonderful. It's one of the one good thing that's come out of the pandemic. And I'm glad to build on the recent one about the successful and important work with police in Indiana. Just confirming that the slides are up because I don't see them on my screen. Are folks seeing them? Here we go. Great. And if we could go to the next slide. Today, we're going to share about how to use advocacy to change policy. And in this case, to go even further in responding to mental health emergencies than you heard about in the last webinar about responding to such emergencies. And this is around a Clubhouse campaign that we're running called Care Responders. I'm going to begin by telling you about our origin story for this campaign. Then I'll provide an overview of the problem and that we're trying to solve and why we think we're at an opportune moment for solving it, for changing things, and the solution we're driving at. And I'll turn over to the nuts and bolts to my colleagues that are also participating in the webinar. So next slide, please. So why now? Mental health crisis response is an issue with particular relevance for Fountain House. That's because a mental health crisis can be deadly business, and that has happened to a member from Fountain House. This is Fountain House member Deborah Dana, who you see in the center of the montage on the slide with the big smile and the great brown hat. Deborah was a 66-year-old Bronx resident and a vibrant and important part of the Fountain House community. She worked in computer technology, and she lived with schizophrenia. At times, she became unwell. This was known to her, people in her apartment where she lived in the Bronx, and it was known to the police, who sometimes had to, step in and help her. And one of those times in 2016, the superintendent of her building called 911 because she was acting erratically. The police came to her apartment without Deborah knowing that they were coming. Her sister let them in, and she was already in a very frightened, alarmed, paranoid state, and seeing the police there just made things worse. And she picked up a baseball bat. And just a reminder, this is a 66-year-old, pretty slight woman. And things got out of hand, and tragically, an officer shot her. There were several, I think there were 4 or 5 officers there, and she died. And this was a galvanizing moment for our community, as well as for all of New York City. And Fountain House has been working with other advocates on alternative responses since then, and Christina will be talking about that in more detail later. This year, we felt we were at a national crossroads when it came to mental health emergencies. It was a moment of opportunity for change that was tragically born out of peril. Not only is there an increase in people with mental health needs because of the pandemic, but the national outcry for police reform following the killings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and then quickly following after that, the deaths of Daniel Pruitt and Walter Wallace, both of whom were killed in police encounters in a mental health crisis, really had raised the possibility for reform. And obviously it's of note that we are having this webinar the day after Derek Chauvin was convicted in the death of George Floyd, which I know is probably very powerful for many people on this call. So we decided to expand our effort beyond New York and work with clubhouses around the country to advocate for changes that would save the lives of the Deborah Danners in other communities. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So I wanted to just set the stage and get us on the same page about the magnitude of the problem. Our de facto response nationally to a mental health emergency is law enforcement and not public health. Again, you define it, it's a health emergency, but we're responding with law enforcement. And while people, as part of this webinar series, you've heard about good outcomes with good police, and believe me, I know that happens. It's not always the case. And when someone who is having a mental health emergency, like Deborah, feeling extremely anxious, maybe paranoid, sees a person in uniform, things can go bad. This is especially so for communities of color, who the police are often seen as not help, but something to be feared. And it's also especially true when police in uniform isn't, a person in uniform isn't trained to do a job that is best managed by a person in a different kind of uniform, a medical uniform, just like we would want a medical person if we were having a heart attack. But all over the country, this is what happens. And at least 1 in every 4 people killed by police has a serious mental illness. I mean, that's a shocking statistic. These people are disproportionately people of color. Overall, 80% of 911 calls are for situations that don't require police in the first place, not just mental health calls, but calls in general. So police are being called on to do a lot of things that are outside of their training. And this is something they recognize. Dealing with people having a mental health crisis is not something that police really say they want to be doing. Next slide. Again, I mentioned that these numbers are likely to increase as the secondary mental health pandemic following COVID continues. We have a sort of a long tail COVID. There are numerous studies showing the mental health impacts, and this is just one that I've cited here, that 53% of adults say that COVID has had a negative impact on their mental health. The statistics for people, for young people are extremely high, and with increases in suicidality. So we can anticipate that there's going to be more mental health crises occurring. Next slide. Wanted to just give a couple of examples of what members and police are saying about the current situation not working. So a Fountain House member said, it becomes a crisis when people aren't supposed to get involved. This is basically that the whole experience of crisis can be defined by the people who are coming, as opposed to the person who is having a discomfort. Might be a crisis, but might be something that could be handled in a different way. And this Clubhouse member from another clubhouse in New York said, I felt like I just robbed the bank. I didn't do anything wrong. I mean, I didn't feel good. I'm sure if I was to go outside and I fell down and had a broken arm or something like that, I don't think I would see 6 police officers. And that's what happened to him when he was called 911 in a crisis. Next slide. And this is from a police chief in Charlottesville, Virginia, who we worked with on a project that I'll talk a little bit about at the end. She said, we're trying to operate within the confines of a system that is failing. And if you want racial justice and equity in a mental health emergency response, police should not be included at all as first responders. So on all sides, people are looking for change. Next slide, please. And communities and police departments are exploring changes as an evolving approach to mental health emergencies. So the first are law enforcement-led models. These include what are called crisis intervention teams, and I think that's what you heard about Indiana. These are programs that train police officers in techniques for working with people in a serious mental health crisis. Again, in Indiana, you heard about this being very successful, and that certainly can be the case. It's not always the case, especially in larger and more diverse communities, as you'll hear from Christina later. Continuing this evolution, there's co-response models, which pair police with mental health experts or peers. So they go out, they're dispatched together. And again, there's some successes with that, but we think that the most significant successes are happening with what we call care response model, which is what we are advocating for. Next slide, please. So what is a care response? Really, law enforcement, like the police chief said in the quote I showed you, law enforcement basically are removed from being the first responders in almost all situations. They're not co-responders. They're not people who are specially trained. They're just not part of the scenario, except in very carefully defined times where there's extreme danger to a person or to others. And instead, medical responders and mental health experts are the ones who are dispatched to a crisis. And often those experts include peers. Next slide. And why care response? I mean, this is a big departure from what most people think, because it works. The most widely known health first response has the unusual name. It's actually an acronym of Cahoots. It stands for Crisis Assistance Helping Out on the Streets. You might have read about this. It's been in the news quite a lot as a police reform alternative, and that's because of the results. It was launched in 1989, came out of a mental health clinic called Whitebird Clinic, when their community was looking for alternatives. And so Cahoots mobilizes two-person teams consisting of a medical person, could be a nurse, a paramedic, or an EMT, and a crisis worker who has substantial training and experience in mental health. Then it runs through 911. That's something that we actually think should change, and they think should change too. But right now it runs through 911, and the dispatchers are very well trained as to know when to call the Cahoots team versus to calling the police. Approximately 75% of Cahoots crisis workers are peers, people with lived mental health experiences. Last year, Cahoots handled more than 24,000 calls. That was about 20% of all the calls dispatched by 911 in Eugene, Oregon, where it is based. And of those times, the Cahoots team had to call for police backup only in 1% of calls, only 250 times. Next slide. So what's the ROI? What's the return on investment on this? That's why we're advocating for this. In their 31-year history, not one Cahoots crisis worker or client has been hurt during a mental health call. Just a reminder of that 1 in 4 deaths site that I talked about before. Also, there is an actual monetary ROI. Cahoots has saved an estimated annual average of $8 million on public safety dollars and $14 million on ambulance and emergency room treatment costs for the city of Eugene, Oregon. Again, going back to 80% of calls not requiring police intervention, many people who are treated by Cahoots teams, they need to, it's not just that they're being saved from going to jail or some sort of tough law enforcement encounter or going to a hospital. Sometimes they need to be connected to housing. Sometimes they need food. Sometimes they just need somebody to talk to. And there are many instances where that is really the outcome of the call. And then there's follow-up to connect them to services. Next slide. Cahoots is based in Eugene, Oregon, as I mentioned. Eugene is a relatively, you might know it from Nike, that's where they invented the sneaker. Eugene is a relatively small and not very diverse town. But it is no longer a boutique Oregon project. Cahoots has inspired many duplications. You see a list of other larger and more diverse cities that have either piloted Cahoots model or are actually using it more widely, customized to their own cities, and so it's really expanding. This is akin to the model we're advocating for in our campaign. We're also, Fountain House is also working with Cahoots now on a training series that they're doing with communities around the country, some of which San Antonio is one of the communities they're working with, as is Cleveland. So next slide. So about clubhouses in our campaign, with members and staff wanting change, and with all this information I just shared with you in hand, we determined that we wanted to be and could be part of the solution, and launched our Care Responders campaign. And we started with 5 great clubhouses around the country: Magnolia in Cleveland, Ohio; Fresh Start in Ann Arbor, Michigan; Hero House in the Seattle area; San Antonio in Texas; Putnam House in the Bay Area in California. And since then, we've actually moved statewide with clubhouses in California, Michigan, and Washington. All these communities, great, strong clubhouses, but they had another thing we researched before we went out to different clubhouses to talk to them about being part of this, to see where there was a pathway to change. There has to be, and Bill will talk more about this, there has to be some funding mechanism, there has to be interest in by policymakers, lawmakers, mayors. So all these communities had some element of that pointed to a possibility for change. Next slide. And why should clubhouses be in the driver's seat? Well, this series of webinars is called WANA, We Are Not Alone, and that's a core principle that clubhouses have been a missing voice at the table in solutions to this crisis that affects clubhouse members. I mean, and to drive change, to really drive change, you really want people who are the ones closest to the problem you're trying to solve for. And here in the US, we have some 60,000 members who can help drive change. Next slide. Social change is always drawn on the voice of those with lived experience. And we see this in other movements like civil rights, women's rights, LGBTQI rights, criminal justice reform. I used to work in criminal justice reform. These movements, the people with lived experience were critical for moving change forward, and that's been a missing piece. Mental health reform is a social justice too, and so critical policy decisions need to be made, that are being made at every level of government. We need to have our members at the table. It goes back to the "nothing about us without us" mantra, which I believe was coined by the disability rights groups and applies certainly to the Clubhouse movement. Next slide. So including peers is a key principle of our campaign, and we sort of have some backup research support now for this. Fountain House 2 weeks ago released a report that highlights these principles and that can be customized for different communities. You hopefully have seen this report, and we can get it to people on this webinar later if you haven't. It's called "From Harm to Health: Centering Race Equity and Lived Experience in Mental Health Crisis Reform." And this was part of a project that Fountain House led, funded by the Ford Foundation, that was designed to listen to a cross-section of perspectives on crisis response with the lens of lived experience and racial equity, which were missing from the table. So this is something we can get in the hands of policymakers and other reformers to help drive the solution forward. A few other key principles that emerge from the report and from our work in Care Responders is, in addition to racial equity and lived experience, are sharply curtailing the role of law enforcement and creating a separate number from 911, such as 988, which you might have heard about previously. And with that, I am going to turn it over to talk about how to drive change, how advocacy in general drives change, and specifically in our campaign, to my longtime friend and partner, Bill Wasserman, who is the architect of this and many other successful advocacy campaigns, some of which I've had the good fortune to work on with him in the past. Thank you, and over to you, Bill.
Thank you, Mary. So like Mary said, I'm Bill Wasserman, and I lead a communications firm that helps nonprofits run campaigns to shape public awareness and make policy change. So we're partnering with clubhouses across the country on the Care Responders campaign. So I was asked to speak a bit about our advocacy work. Can we pull up the next slide? Okay. There we go. Next one. Yeah. First, I'll start by addressing sort of why we should make advocacy a priority. We know that states are laboratories of innovation, and they can really ladder up to national change. Like, to improve the opportunities of people facing severe mental illness, we need to shape policies ranging from healthcare to housing to criminal justice, and like we're talking about today, the work on policing. This work actually reminds me quite a bit of work I was involved in the public health community to reduce the harm from tobacco products, especially focused on reducing youth smoking rates. Public health groups like the American Heart Association and Lung Association in the mid-90s were mostly focused on a public health education model, working one-on-one with individuals to educate people about the health impacts of smoking and help them quit. Smoking rates, and if they did that, they felt that smoking rates would go down. But essentially it wasn't working. And the foundations who supported the community and tobacco control leaders and activists decided that what they needed to do was shape the public policy to help stop a new generation from being addicted to tobacco products. So if you fast forward over 20 years, we passed smoke-free workplace bans in cities and states across the country, even in the tobacco industry's home state, Virginia. We increased taxes on cigarettes and tobacco products that funded cessation programs and impacted sales. And after a 14-year effort, we secured the authority of the Food and Drug Administration to regulate tobacco as a drug and won a $300 billion settlement from the industry. Now, after 20 years, youth smoking rates are 50% lower than they were 20 years ago. And that work in the tobacco advocacy community nationally also linked up with global advocates to shape a treaty, an international treaty on tobacco control that has led to policy change in the UK and Russia and India that is driving smoking rates down nationally. So I think we can go to the next slide. So how do you run campaigns that win? As I mentioned, it takes more than just educating people about the facts. Most importantly, we need to be clear what our goal is and what decision makers, whether they're in government, like local government or state legislatures, or maybe even Congress, can give us the change we seek. First we organize and educate and build power by mobilizing supporters, but we also combine different tactics. I like to talk about the importance of a focus on both exercising power, but also persuasion. And so what do I mean by that? So power tactics, what I mean is it's not enough to show decision makers that we have the right position on an issue. We need to show them that there is political support for change. So we include in campaign tactics things like letter writing campaigns from constituents to key decision makers. Hero House out in Seattle organized a lobby day and set up meetings with Clubhouse members with their legislators in Olympia. This year it was done by Zoom, but it really helped set the stage for a budget proposal that is being considered and will be introduced just today that will mean a significant increase in funding for expanding clubhouses and investing in a care response program statewide. But persuasion is important. It is important to demonstrate the facts. Fountain House just released, like Mary referenced, the front end report to demonstrate the racial equity issues that demand action on mental health crisis response. And also in a number of our campaign sites, we've placed opinion pieces in local papers to make the case for the need for care response and position Clubhouse leaders as thought leaders. Several of those op-eds have paired Clubhouse directors with a member to bring out that voice of people with lived experience. But I think it's also important to note that we can't win alone. We should have the research and recruit the allies and mobilize them, but we also need to bring in others from the behavioral health or other allies from the community in order to advocate for change. I think this really is the moment for change around police reform and for standing up a care responders effort. I think we're catching a wave. There's already a conversation going on around how policing needs to change. We can reduce harm, particularly for communities of color, when we reduce the frontline role that law enforcement plays in mental health crisis. It's a smart policy and it makes sense. But again, I just want to reinforce what I think are the four sort of pillars of a successful campaign. One, we need to know who can give us the change we seek. Is it the city council, the mental health system funder? Do we need to go to the state legislature to change policy or seek funds? Two, we need allies from the behavioral health community, law enforcement, business community, criminal justice reform advocates. But then third, we need proof points from existing models like Cahoots in Eugene or the STAR program in Denver. But also, I think it's always effective to bring forward people with lived experience and the agency to be advocates who give us the voice in the media, through social media, by presenting testimony at public hearings or speaking out in the media. And that's how we can make change. And I think we're deploying all those strategies. You can go to the next slide. We'll hear in much greater detail from Christina and Eric about work in New York and San Antonio. But in all of the other states and cities and communities where we're working, we're gaining momentum led by Hero House and Magnolia House and Putnam House and a number of the other clubhouses in California. And in fact, just today in Washington, we'll see a budget proposal lifted up that should mean a significant increase in care response funding. In Cleveland on Monday, a really critical mental health stakeholder confirmed their commitment to stand up a program in Cleveland. And on Monday, or just yesterday, combined with a proposal to stand up statewide in California a 988 system, there's also a requirement that every county in the legislation that was considered yesterday stand up a care response program, and it passed out of committee just yesterday. So I think the momentum is there and a real opportunity for the clubhouses to connect. So with that, I'll turn it over to Christina to talk about New York.
Thanks, Bill. Good morning, everyone. My name is Christina Sparrick. I'm a certified public accountant, a Fountain House member, a steering committee member of Correct Crisis Intervention Today, and a New York City Fountain House Advocacy Advisor. I became an advocate for care response back in 2013 when I was assaulted by a former friend. And in response to the attack, I called 911 and I said, I live with bipolar disorder and I have been assaulted, but that was a mistake. I was under the impression as a person with a mental health disability that law enforcement would provide me with the same treatment and care as a senior citizen as a child, but I was wrong. Instead, the officers refused to take my complaint and the assailant fled the scene of the crime. That day, my rights were violated, and that's when I became an advocate. This leads me to my presentation, The Evolution of New York City Care Response. Slides, I'm sorry, yeah. Next slide, please. So communities for Crisis Intervention Team in New York City, or CCIT NYC, is a coalition comprised of peers and community organizations such as Fountain House, and is led by Community Access, a community-based mental health organization in New York City. CCIT was launched back in 2012, and our collective goal was to, one, was to educate police on how to deal with people in emotional distress and to reduce harm. Two, was to bridge the relationship between NYPD and the mental health community. In order to accomplish this, CCIT advocated for the Crisis Intervention Team training, the CIT model, which is the same model in Memphis, where police were trained on de-escalation techniques and crisis communication skills when dealing with people in emotional crisis. 3 years later, in 2015, we succeeded in our efforts, and a New York City mayor launched the first crisis intervention training program in New York City. Soon after, our coalition realized that the CIT model in New York City wasn't sufficient to prevent harm to people experiencing mental health crisis. Next slide. Thank you. So in some communities, we know that the CIT model works, like in Indiana, but it wasn't working as we hoped in New York City. New York City is a large, diverse community with a very powerful police department, a department that many people in the community do not trust. So by now you're wondering why, what went wrong in New York City? So over a 6-year span of the CIT training, from June 2015 to present, 15 of 18 people of emotional distress killed by cops were people of color. Compare this to 7 years later, from 2007 to 2014, pre-CIT training, 8 people were killed. By March 2020, due to COVID, CIT training stopped. But by this time, it was reported that 18,000 NYPD officers were CIT trained at a cost of $5.3 million. Yet CIT wasn't working in New York City. Next photo, please. Next slide, please. Thanks. Since the inception of CIT in New York City in 2015, again, 15 out of 18 people were killed of color. Deborah Dana, a former Fountain House member, which was seen in the top far right of the photos, is a very loved person in Fountain House community. She was one of the 15 of the 18 people killed of color. And to the right, you see the chart from 2014 to 2018, the numbers of mental health calls are trending up. Next slide, please. CTIT realized that we needed a real systemic change and that a task force focused on better crisis response was needed. To get a task force, we needed to buy-in from elected officials like City Councilman Donovan Richards, who was very supportive of us. We held press conferences, rallies. We were featured in the news and social media. We were pushing the issue that our lives matter, that we needed to be at the table, and that there was nothing about us. So by 2018, we got what we wanted. The mayor convened the Crisis Prevention and Response Task Force. Next slide, please. Progress was slow, but we were resilient. We were a resilient group. And we were mission driven, and we knew we had to evolve. So we changed our name from Communities for Crisis Intervention Training to Correct Crisis Intervention Today, New York City, Fighting to Transform Response to Mental Health Crisis. We worked with Cahoots. We held forums and listened to the peer community and used the information collected to draft our first CCIT peer-driven response pilot. Our goal was to have a public health response, keep people in crisis in their communities, connect them to services. Our proposal was to have one EMT and one trained peer crisis responder, a peer who would use the person-centered and holistic approach when treating people. Second, we were able to identify 2 precincts who had the highest mental health rates in New York City, which was the 71st precinct, which is in Brownsville, and the 14th precinct, which is like Midtown South of Manhattan. Third, in our proposal, we decided to use 4 vans to transport people in distress to drop-off shelters and respite centers, and 24/7 urgent care clinics once they were built up in the city. We also factored in the budget and the cost of the pilot, which would be $16.5 million for a 5-year pilot, or $3.3 million a year. We also wanted a separate number outside of 911, which would be a New York City well number, which we use in the city to call for support, emergency support, mental health supports, or an alternative number within a community, or a number such as 988. And we wanted to have a oversight committee, which would not be city controlled as it is now, but it would consist of 51% peers from the Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. We have had meetings with elected officials such as the mayor's office, senators, city council, public advocate, and was able to get support for our initiative, but it's still taking time, and we're not where we want it to be now. Next slide, please. Our first mental health town hall was in December 2020. This is my brainchild. Too often in the mental health community, our people do not exercise their rights to vote, and we do not know who to vote for. Mental health is rarely discussed. Mental health is a topic that's rarely discussed in many circles, and this was so important to have our first mental health town hall. The goal was to empower the mental health community with knowledge and give them the opportunity to build power, to teach the community that voting is critical for systemic change. And again, which is more powerful than anything, that there's nothing about us. There is nothing about us without us. Also, that the mental health community will also, this is what's so important, that we, the mental health community, will meet and work with the New York City mayor at their office on the first day of their job. And we will never be an afterthought, but we will stand proud and strong every single day, fighting for our rights. As for the candidates who attended, there were 10. One was missing off the flyer. He came late. As the co-sponsors, we were fortunate to garner support from 13 co-sponsors from criminal justice, housing, and legal communities, including Fountain House and more. We had 1,800 registrants and 2,500 Facebook views, which is a success for the first event. And lastly, as for a highlight, 9 out of the 10 candidates supported the CCIT peer-driven response pilot, and that was a victory. Next slide, please. So this is where we are today. Mary mentioned about evolution in the presentation, and definitely Bill mentioned about how campaigns work, and which is actually I'm covering a lot of in my presentation. So Thrive New York City, Be Heard pilot is the city's version of a public health response of a mental health call. It's called Be Heard is called Behavioral Health Emergency Assistance Response Division, which is going to be launched sometime in spring 2021. The city selected 3 precincts, the 25th, the 28th, and the 32nd precincts in Harlem. Their mental health response team would consist of health and hospital social workers, which will use a clinical model, and FDNY EMT, fire department EMTs. The police and EMTs would respond if there's an imminent risk or harm or weapon involved. And their steering committee was all city agencies, which was FDNY, Health and Hospitals, Department of Mental Health, NYPD, and the Mayor's Office of Thrive. Advocates had serious concerns about the structure of the city's new mental health response. And the list is on to the right side of the screen. By Thrive's own estimates, 30% of the calls would still be directed through NYPD. Moreover, all calls will still continue to go through 911, which is NYPD's jurisdiction. The entire program will be run by FDNY and other city agencies. There are no requirements to hire peers. The anticipated response time would be up to 30 minutes, which is too long. And the pilot was only to operate 16 hours a day, which we would really like a 24-hour response, 24-hour pilot. There was no outcome and effectiveness metrics have been developed, and there was no roles for peers and in the community there was no roles for peers and community members to establish this program and oversee it. Next slide. So as we continue to advocate, CCIT and Fountain House has been in the game for 9 years, making progress. It's slow, but it's an evolution, as Mary stated earlier in this presentation. And it's not fast as we like, but we will continue to advocate. So for now, with the legislative proposals, CCIT continues to review policies, testified hearings. We meet with elected officials to share our stories. We help them with their drafting of the language and legislations. But what I've learned and what we've learned in the community over the 9 years, that systemic change doesn't happen overnight. It really, truly does take time. The success of the care response means a lot to CCIT, Fountain House, and to me, because this is why we all advocate. And I would like to leave with a quote. Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about the things that matter. That's Martin Luther King Jr. And so I thank you for your time, and I'd like to turn it over to Eric Estrada. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. I'm Eric Estrada in San Antonio Clubhouse. I've been part of this community for about 7 years now in a variety of different roles. And my colleague and I are going to go over just a couple of things that we've experienced as a clubhouse that is undergoing one of these care response campaigns, what that's looked like for us, and some of the lessons that we have learned. I think a lot of the folks that are on this call are probably from a clubhouse, maybe considering doing something like this. And so we just want to share some of the experiences that we have. So I'm going to ask for the slides to come back up and then pass it over to Taylor to introduce herself and to get us started.
Thank you, Eric. My name is Taylor Rowe, and I have been a staff member of the San Antonio Clubhouse for 3 years. I am excited to be here talking about a very prevalent topic and really highlighting some of the experiences that the San Antonio Clubhouse has had during our campaign here locally. For our overview of the conversation today, we're just going to talk about some of the efforts that our city stands at today, how our members have been involved, how the campaign has challenged us and has been a benefit to us, and some advice that we have for future clubhouses who want to do something similar in their respective cities. Next slide, please. So one thing that we are proud to say is that here in San Antonio, Texas, our city is listening. Through our various conversations with our local city officials and different advocacy groups, we understand that people are taking heed to the information that we're given, and they're trying to understand how to put all of that information into use. So we have 3 different ways that we have really seen that our city is listening and wanting to be a part of a more comprehensive response to crisis. First and foremost, they have paid $150,000 for a study to be enacted here in the city that will determine if we need a more co-response or care response model in San Antonio, Texas. This is very important for us. We understand that they are following the acts of other cities here in Texas, like Dallas, who have used the same group to do the same study and have created a successful co-response model for their city. So we're excited that they're studying our city. In about mid-June, we should have the results of that to see what is that going to start to look like within our city. Also, our city leadership is hosting several listening sessions. So in February of this year, our city sent out a poll to different residents asking about their comfortability with the San Antonio Police Department. They had about 1,100 responses, where about half of the responses said that they do feel safe with SAPD, but that safety does vary whether it's in the night or whether it's in the morning. So because of that poll, our city officials have started to have these listening sessions. Last night was the first listening session, and I was floored to be a part of that. Not only were they asking specific questions that were a result of that poll, they had a type of software where we as constituents could literally respond to each question so that they can capture each and every one of our responses. I was very shocked at how that went. A lot of responses were interesting. Some were for police, some were against it. Nevertheless, our city was listening. And I think as a resident, that makes us feel confident in that they are trying to find the most pragmatic solution for us. So those sessions are going to happen for the entirety of this month and next month. And that, along with the results from the study and other polling that they're doing, they're going to determine what's going to be best for our city in enacting something similar to a care response model or a co-response model. Through our work as leaders in this campaign of San Antonio Clubhouse, we have gained leverage within the community as well, and that has been exciting. We were invited to participate in a training along with Cahoots, which we've talked about a lot today, in determining how to capture data and use data to formulate something similar to a care response model within our city. It is exciting to be a part of this team. We have several of our city official staff members on our team. So we have grounds at the table from our mayor's office, from city council office, and that's exciting. But we're also leading the team, which really speaks to our desire to be, you know, the forerunners in the local mental health initiative and being advocates. So we are in this training for the next 8 weeks, and we are joined by several cities across the nation. And it's just really exciting for us to have the opportunity to utilize this campaign and really gain leverage in ensuring that these conversations are heard and something is done about it. Next slide, please. So how are our members involved? I'm very excited to hear how members have really been at the forefront of the movement in New York, because our members are doing the very same thing here in San Antonio. We are ensuring that our members are doing the very same thing, writing letters, having speeches, submitting questions to our elected officials, because this is important. Our members are the experts. Their lived experience deemed them experts in this material. So who better to challenge local city officials on providing the best response than our members? And that's what we have done. We're really empowering our members and giving them all of the room possible to really help us seek the best solutions when it comes to crisis response here in our city. A great way that we are choosing to do that is through the creation of a program called the Harbor House Program. So we have understood that in our city, just as many cities across the nation, there is a space needed for individuals who are experiencing immediate crisis to have some type of safe space to go to beyond the hospital or the jail or wherever else they will go, where they don't receive much help. We are trying to set the foundation of that program here in San Antonio to offer that to our city. And our members are helping us develop the program. Matter of fact, they are leading the conversations. They're using their lived experiences, their interactions with local law enforcement to say, this is what works and this isn't what works. And we need to find some type of middle ground to ensure that in crisis response, the individual is put first, and policy and all of this other stuff that typically is focused on is second, right? We want to have a more public health approach to this, an approach where people feel heard, valued, seen, and a part of something. So it's been very exciting for us to have our members a part of this initiative the whole entire way. And they've really felt empowered and really desiring to keep going forward in this movement. And with that, I'll pass it back to Eric.
Can we go to the next slide, please? So I'm going to talk a bit about how this has been just challenging for us and some of the things that we've learned through the process. Even getting started with this was a challenge for us, right? Thinking about this initially, when we first heard about this campaign and the goal and the history of the movement in New York, we had to ask ourselves, is this a thing that we even really want to do? You know, like Christina said, every city has kind of a different approach to everything. And San Antonio historically has had a very progressive police force, really early innovation around CIT, around models that are similar to co-response, and a lot of really great things that happened in our city. And so when we looked at that, we thought, you know, is this a problem in our community? And then that's when we had to step back and say, well, maybe this is a thing that we need to look at anyway, even though things don't seem as difficult in our town, doesn't mean that it couldn't be better, you know? So that was an early thing that we had to wrestle with. Is this a thing that we're even wanting to get involved with? And I'll talk a little bit more about it in the next slide, but I think this was a good decision for us. We were also talking about, do we really want to engage in this kind of advocacy locally? Because again, we are historically have been seen as an organization that is really kind of in the middle of a lot of things, but not necessarily leading those things. We have heard from some key stakeholders in the community that we have somehow managed to be well respected within the peer community, with the adults that have lived experience, but also really well respected with the care provider community in the hospitals and the traditional systems, where some groups do a really good job of advocating, but aren't able to be invited to the table, aren't able to be part of the solutions. We've been able to do that. And so even in this early conversation, we had to determine, do we want to be in the middle of this advocating and potentially upsetting some of the community partners and people that we traditionally have had pretty good relationships with. And again, we'll talk about on the next slide why or how that's worked out for us. And ultimately, you know, as a clubhouse, we're understaffed. Everyone is understaffed, you know, and so the question is, do we have the bandwidth for another initiative? We ended up pursuing the project anyway, and shifting some of our personnel, some of our resources. I've been able to shift some of my time. A lot of Taylor's time has been able to be shifted over to this project to do things that we hadn't planned on doing, things like leading all of this work with our members who are designing this new harbor program. And we've been fortunate to be able to work with community partners locally that have been able to help shepherd this for us, and in a lot of ways be our mentors on how we could approach our conversation. So we have a team locally that is supporting us, and that is a thing that is new for us. We've never really done that kind of thing before, engage folks to like guide work that we are doing. But it's been a really, really positive experience for us, and we've been able to make do with the idea that we're going to just be short-staffed. We're pulling people out of the work order day. Sometimes there's work that goes into the work order day. Sometimes things are happening after clubhouse hours, like our members and the work that Taylor described earlier. That is a program that is happening in the evening. The gap that we're trying to fill is an evening gap. And so our members are meeting every day, for about 3 hours every other day, to work on the development of this new program. And so we've been able to find ways to work around this. And, you know, like they say, you know, when there's a will, there's a way, right? So we've made it a priority, and so far it's I think been very effective for us. Can we go to the next slide, please? So some of the ways that this has benefited us, outside of the obvious, you know, fact that Taylor mentioned, our city is moving forward in a lot of different avenues towards this idea of care response. I feel like today we're kind of in the eye of the storm. Things are pretty calm, but because we've been working for months now to do a lot of different things. And right now we are in this work with Cahoots. We have people gearing up for the local budget sessions or budget season. And so there's a lot of different moving pieces that I think will all culminate towards the end of May and in June that'll let us know where we're going with this. Instead of advocating for funding in our community, we've been actually advocating really more for operational work, for things to happen, for things to get started. And we have been real clear in all of our conversations with folks that we are coming to people not only as an advocate who represents, you know, we represent a community of adults who experience mental illness, but we're also coming as practitioners, people that have skin in the game and that are willing to sacrifice and make things happen for there to be programs and solutions in our community. We're not just coming to knock on doors and ask for things. We're willing to do things. And that has allowed us to have a lot of exposure across the city in ways that we've never had in the past. In just as part of this campaign, we've been able to meet with all levels of city leadership, all the way to the top decision makers in our community, from the health departments, from the city itself, with the mayor, with their key staff, with the leadership in the police department, with the leadership in the emergency response systems. A lot of folks with whom we've had challenges in the past, like we've had challenges getting in front of them. This campaign has made a lot of that possible. It's created a lot of awareness for what the San Antonio Clubhouse can do and be in our community. And I think it's allowed us to be taken maybe a little more seriously in some spaces where we in the past have known that we can provide value and support. That doesn't necessarily mean that people understand that. And so we've had a lot of exposure as part of this campaign. We've also had, in that same vein, a lot of awareness about the things that we are already doing, like peer support, which we do a lot of in our community. We are effectively the peer support people in our city, but people didn't necessarily know that because this is a really nascent field in San Antonio. We've been able to get a lot of awareness of that. We also have awareness about the idea of this harbor program that Taylor had mentioned, and the fact that we are actively working with our members to develop something that can happen in the evenings that is an alternative to what exists now, which is basically nothing. You have jail, you have a hospital, and you have nothing. And so this has been really cool to be able to get out there and have people see this and have some of those key stakeholders like the emergency response systems ask questions about co-creating stuff. Like, how far along is this? How can this tie into the systems that already exist? So that's been really, really cool. And the last thing that's been really beneficial about being part of this initiative is the idea that I think of as just kind of positive peer pressure and accountability. You know, we're lucky to be able to be doing this with Putnam Clubhouse and Magnolia Clubhouse and Fountain House, and be able to know that other folks are working on the same things that we're trying to work on, because it really, in a lot of ways, kind of forces us to stay in it. I think there's times in this process where if we were undertaking this completely by ourselves, there are times where you could get demoralized, where things slow down, where it maybe seems like things are happening, and so you kind of just stop and wait, and you lose momentum. And again, we've been really fortunate to be able to have frequent check-ins with other people working on this, frequent check-ins with Fountain House, and frequent check-ins with our local team, which has kept us going, right? So when we have maybe lacked the energy or the vision to see some things, we've had other people there along the way to support us, and that's allowed us to keep going. And that's really, really, really great for us. I think that's it. Are there any more slides? Oh, yeah, our actual advice, right? So these are the questions that we basically asked ourselves, or that I would recommend people ask themselves if you're thinking about this, is can you benefit from better mental health response in your community? For us, the answer to that is yes. And I would say that probably for everyone, the answer is yes. And so even though we came into this thinking, we don't know, I don't know if we really have that kind of problem in San Antonio. That doesn't mean that there isn't room for improvement, right? And so this is the cool thing about being part of this network is that there are ways of improving ourselves and improving our community, and you can learn from the other people that have done similar things. So I'd ask you, can you benefit from better mental health services and response in your community? And the second is, can your clubhouse benefit from more exposure? Because that is going to happen. You know, there's that saying that everyone always has of clubhouses being the best kept secret in the world of mental health services. Well, this is a really good way to get out and talk to people and to be able to show we're part of this worldwide movement doing all these wonderful things. It's always surprising to me when we talk to folks and they say, there's other clubhouses? You know, it's like, yes, there's hundreds of clubhouses around the world. You know, you can step into clubhouses on almost any continent and they feel like our clubhouse. And that gives us, I think, I don't know, a bit maybe of, you know, I lost the word. We're able to be taken a little bit maybe more serious when people realize it's not just our organization. There are people everywhere doing the same thing. So that's a question that I would ask yourself if you're thinking about this. And ultimately, I think Christina probably said it best, and that is this can look different in different places. And our approach for San Antonio Clubhouse, we are really hands-on, very operational in nature, and we do a lot of projects, experiments, and pilot things. And that's the approach we've taken to care response is how do we get our hands dirty and do something to support a solution and bring that to the community and then co-create with the community. That works for us and we're able to invest the energy that way, but that doesn't mean that other people have to do that. I think other cities doing this work are doing it differently and they have different outcomes, they have different visions and strategies, and that's okay. This doesn't have to be one size fits all. And so I would say that is something to keep in mind. Just because other people do something doesn't mean you have to do it the same way. And that is all that I had. I'm gonna pass it over to Alex, I think, for the next part of this.
Thank you, Eric. And Thank you everybody so much for joining us so far today. We do understand that we're going to be a little bit over today, so we do understand also if you have to hop off, if you have prior obligations. But before we break, we definitely want to open it up for some questions and answers. So for that, I will turn it back over to our host.
For those that have a question they would like to ask, please submit your question in the Q&A panel on the right, located on the bottom right-hand side of your screen, or by pressing the three-dot option along the bottom and selecting the Q&A panel. Your first question: what is the first step a small clubhouse could take to begin a similar advocacy campaign locally?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because as you saw throughout this entire presentation, we kind of went from a 30,000 foot point of view to a 20,000 foot point of view, to then being able to hear from Eric and San Antonio Clubhouse of what they're doing there. So I think this is a good question for you guys, Eric, as far as what's just a first step folks can take towards achieving this, because it can feel sometimes too big to touch.
Yeah, and Taylor, please feel free to jump in if you have a different thought on this. I think one of the things that we've been able to do is just spend a lot of time talking with our members. Taylor and a few other of our leaders in the community have been able to hold a lot of these like planning sessions to talk about what does a solution look like, what are our needs. And I've not been part of all those conversations, but I have been floored to hear about our members' experiences. You know, I think one of the things that's interesting about being in the clubhouse is you spend so much time with each other that you don't realize some of the really traumatic experiences that a lot of our folks have had, especially when it comes to things like this. And so I would think by talking to your folks and figuring out, what do you even want to do? What is your goal? What would you like to accomplish? And then from there, start to figure out, is this something you can do fully on your own? Is this something where you can reach out to other clubhouses and talk to them? Because you have to understand what's happening in your community already. Our approach has been a response to what is happening in San Antonio, the timing of things, preparing strategically, again, based on the recommendations of people that we know, to how to frame things and how to sequence things. And that's been, again, really helpful information, but it all started with us saying, this is what the ideal state would be. And if this doesn't work, these other alternatives would also be great. And even if this thing does happen, we might still get all these other benefits from doing this. And so just talking as a community about what you would like to see happen allows you to start thinking about what you want to do. And I'm sure that everyone on this call is available to support those kinds of initiatives, and anyone who's doing this now would be happy to provide support in that way. Taylor, I don't know if you have anything that you would add to that.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Eric. Having those conversations to identify at what point do you really want to be the forerunners in the movement is important, because this is a large movement with so many moving pieces. And it is overwhelming to attack it just head on, right? But having those conversations and determining at what aspect do we want to be advocates in this movement is going to be central to you really enacting that campaign in your city locally. So yeah, I completely agree with Eric.
Eric, this Bill, I just jump in with one thing related to the care response program, which is I think it's really helpful to start out this advocacy work by just understanding how crisis is handled in your city. So is there a mobile crisis program? Is it who funds it? Who operates it? So you have a sense of the lay of the land. And then I would also think of like talking to people like at NAMI and other behavioral health institutions, just gauge their interest and focus on the issue. So that's where I'd start.
Can I just put in a plug here also in response to that question? I think what Taylor and Eric said is just right, but just want people to be thinking about too, the 988 rollout, which I mentioned a little bit, which is the alternate number that a lot of, well, the federal government is pushing to have implemented, but there's a lot of work that has to happen. And I think it's something Fountain House is going to be thinking about, you know, is this the next phase of another campaign? So I think if people want to be, you have that on your radars as something else to think about, and we'll be circling around that at some point too.
Yeah, and just for my own edification, because I'm a tangible learner, I'm breaking it down into steps. I would say establish understanding of the issue at hand, communicate with your clubhouse to see where everybody is with that topic, and then communicate with your community and identify the players in your community that you can enact change with. So I think it was a great question.
Great. How can my clubhouse raise awareness of the crisis response issue with our own membership and in the local community?
Excellent question. I think it's so funny that it continues to revolve around, and that's so Clubhouse as well. Just where's the community in this? And I think I would speak on behalf of everybody on this call, and especially those that are part of this care response campaign, that without the community, there's none of this, right? The true power and enactment of change and folks that can come to the table really starts and stops with the membership. And so I think, Christina, do you want to take on this question as far as how people and folks can communicate with their clubhouses around these things?
Well, with me, it's like I do a lot of recruitment to bringing people to clubhouses and informing them about what a care response would look like. So the way I do it is I'm a member of every organization out there, and I show up to just about every meeting out there. So I think it's always important to be present. Anytime there's like an issue when it comes to criminal justice or housing or education or employment, I'm at the table because most people don't have conversations about mental health. So when I bring the conversation about, do you know that people with mental health conditions are more likely to have higher sentences in the jail system, and they need to be, when they transition out, they need supportive housing. So this is how I start the conversation, and then they start to become more interested in about maybe the Fountain House model and how to be more active in the community. And this is how you get the numbers. This is showing up at different type of organizations and any kind of social justice setting or getting people more involved.
All right, great. Well, did anyone else want to jump in before we close up?
I'll jump in again, and I think what Christina said is a great response, and also getting people comfortable with social media where they can respond to things that are going on in their communities and with members is another sort of great tool. I think there's tools to work on. And again, also we are hoping to develop at Fountain House I'm working on this with Christina, an advocacy academy that would be something for members. We probably started at Fountain House, but broaden it to members around the country to get training in advocacy. Some of what it sounds like Tahlar is doing in San Antonio right now. So that there's an understanding of how things change, how policy gets made, and how people can contribute by telling their stories, but also signing petitions, letter writing campaigns, being using social media. So more to come on that also, and I think just the lowest lift is probably putting things out on social media that are around your interests.
All right, great. So that was actually our last question for today. So if we have not answered your question, please send an email to the WANA Webinar at fountainhouse.org. The PowerPoint for today's session will be sent directly to everyone in attendance, and the recording will be made available next week. There will be a survey on screen once the event ends. Please take a moment to fill it out and give us your feedback. Thank you for coming to the webinar. Please be on the lookout for announcements regarding our future webinars. Have a great day.